Tonight we've got Dr. Michael P. Ward speaking to us. He's an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences, and he's also an avian ecologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey. Dr. Ward researches population dynamics and behavior of birds, research that takes him throughout the Midwest and into Mexico. He's currently engaged in the USDA's State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement research, tracking neotropical migrants as they move from Alabama to the Yucatan. Tonight, Dr. Ward will bring his understanding of avian ecology and behavior and his knowledge of birds' habitat selection to his presentation, describing design features and plantings we can introduce into our home gardens to make them both inviting to and protective of the variety of songbirds that frequent our area. Take it away, Dr. Ward.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'll be kind of blending together some my research, some of the talks I give with master naturalists, and then some of the ideas I have with how to make your backyard good for birds. I'm obviously a avian ecologist, but my dad owned a nursery, and so for years I thought about how to kind of blend these things together. And so we're going to start off talking about a little bit about birds and why birds would show up in your backyard. Because depending on where you're at, what you want to put in your backyard, there's going to be a different suite of birds throughout Illinois or throughout the world that are going to show up in your backyard. And here's just a kind of collage of a lot of different species that may be in your yard from time to time. And so we're going to go over what birds are we attracting? Why might they stop in your yard? So different times of year, obviously we're right in the migratory pathway of lots of birds. And so that's what makes Illinois very interesting. We don't have huge mountains or oceans to attract lots of birds, but we actually get quite a few bird species and a lot of interesting ones as they migrate through the Midwest. And then what are they doing in your yard, right? So depending on what they're doing, kind of dictates what you might want to do in your backyard to try to keep them to stay or to help them out during their long journey. So obviously habitat is what attracts birds and keeps them there. And so habitat is what we have in your yard, right? So it's decisions you make to plant this or not plant this, to mow this, or rake your leaves, not rake your leaves. So we'll talk about gardening and management. So they're kind of one and the same, right? So when I teach this semester, every fall I teach fish and wildlife ecology here at the University of Illinois, and so we talk a lot about management. And the reality is, I talk to the students a lot of times it's not much different than gardening. We'll talk about some of the threats birds face in your backyard and what you can do to help reduce those threats, and what the future holds in terms of both birds and for what people can do to help birds in their backyard. So why are they going to stop in your yard? So there's a few different things they might be doing in your yard. One would be breeding, and one's wintering. Another one is migrating through. So the birds breeding in Illinois in your yard, there's quite a few depending on where you're at in the state and kind of how big your yard is, what kind of habitat you have. But these are just some of the basic ones, cardinals, chipping sparrows, mourning doves, house sparrows, starlings, house finches, Cooper's hawks, American robins. And, we can help those species. A lot of those species, as we'll talk about later in the talk, have recently decided that they want to live in your backyard and not live out in more natural areas for one reason or the other. And so it really becomes, from a conservation perspective, important that we have these backyards for these birds to breed in. And then you have this time of year. So backyard wintering birds. Just today or yesterday, I put out my bird feeder. I've been kind of negligent in putting it out this year. And then I had a bunch of these birds, which some of you might know. These are pine siskins. So this year is an amazing year for pine siskins. Most years, these birds breed in the boreal forests. They don't make it all the way down to Illinois in winter. And already I've seen hundreds in Champaign, and I had 12 at my feeder today, the first bird that showed up in my feeder. And so lots of birds that breed up in the north come down in the winter to take advantage of a little bit the better weather and a little bit more food. So also I should have mentioned before when we got going, if you have questions, I guess I would hold them to the end and we'll do it via chat. So it could get too many questions as we go through this. But if you have a really pressing question, you can put it on chat and I might see it. So, and again, lots of interesting birds. We'll talk about bird feeding here in a second. And then migratory birds. These are my favorite type of birds, and really why I think Illinois is very well poised to help with bird conservation. So you have lots of warblers, thrushes, grosbeaks, tanagers, catbirds that are all migrating through Illinois. This is a rose-breasted grosbeak, the picture right here. So these do breed in some areas, particularly in northern Illinois, but majority of you guys' yards, this is just going to be a bird that's going to stop over probably the first couple weeks in May, and then they stopped over about 3 weeks ago on their way back south. And we'll talk here in a second about why it's so important. So going into some basic science, just about why your yard is so important. This are next red radar. So you guys are probably familiar with this in the context of looking at where the storms are going, right? But when the next red radar works, well, the raw data from next red radar is shooting out energy and it bounces back from wherever it hits. Well, what the data they show you on your local news filters out birds and insects because they move faster than clouds do, right? But we can take the raw data and see where the birds are. And so this is showing on a given night the distribution of birds. So on a given night, millions of birds are migrating over a given area. And in this picture on the left here, there's a few sites along the Elmer River, Peoria, Chautauqua, Crane Lake, Springfield, Clinton Lake. But this is not the greatest. I couldn't find the one I really wanted. But if you look at central northern Illinois and somewhat in southern Illinois on a night in, say, late April, early May, when it gets dark, so birds migrate at night, you'll see it light up all the cities. So Springfield, Decatur, Peoria, Champaign. And that's because that's where a lot of our forest is, at least in central Illinois. And that's where these birds are stopping over. So they're in your backyard eating because most birds migrate at night. And so what they do during the day is eat. And so the question is, they're migrating over this big expanse of agriculture. Sun comes up in the morning, where do they go? And so for millions of birds in Illinois, where they go ends up being your backyard. And now it might not, some yards are better than others, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's essentially anywhere in the Midwest. When the sun comes up during migration, these birds a lot of times are out over areas that they, can't take advantage of. And so they're going to be coming to your yard. So what are they doing all day in your yard? So again, these birds are migrating at night. And so if you go out at night, you can actually hear these birds flying over, giving call notes. So what they're doing is they are eating during the day. Here's a Baltimore Oriole and a rose-breasted grosbeak. And what they got to do is they got to get fat. And so we want fat birds. I'll show you here. We do, this is a little bit of my research, but it does go back a lot to what you guys can do in your backyard. So in this case, we had done some research down the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. So in this figure here, this is where we tag birds with transmitters up in not very far from Mobile, Alabama, and they migrate down to Yucatan. And what we found is a lot of birds don't make it. In fact, the number one content of sharks that are by oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico is birds like rose-breasted grosbeak and Baltimore Orioles. So obviously the sharks aren't jumping out of the water eating these birds. These birds are dying flying across the Gulf of Mexico. And the reason they're not making it, such as this picture down here, this is a dead Pathonetary warbler that washed up on a beach when we were doing work down in the Yucatan, is they don't have enough fat, right? So fat is the energy they use to migrate. It's their gasoline, right? So that's what they need. And so that comes back to what you can do, right? So even though we're talking about birds migrating across the Gulf of Mexico, these birds are getting fat in Effingham and St. Louis and throughout the Midwest. And so the sad part is actually when they get down to the Gulf, a lot of the Gulf has been developed for condominiums and such. And so they don't actually have areas that get fattened up down there very well. And so we need to fatten them up before they start heading, get all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So what are the birds doing in your yard and what can you do to help them? So first off, your backyard, again, if they're going to get fat, we got to get them food. This is what it comes down to. So most of the birds in your yard throughout the year are hoping to use your backyard, your garden, your property as a place to eat. So this time of year, kind of in fall, so we're kind of past the fruit and insect part of fall, but we're kind of into the seeds. And actually, there are birds that eat insects all winter long out of the bark of trees. In spring, it's insects, and summer, it's insects. So it's a combination of creating backyards where we can provide the resources for birds to get these insects and to get the fruit and the seeds. Whoops. So another question is, where in your backyard can birds sleep? I don't know if you've given this much thought. I really hadn't given this too much thought until we started doing research on West Nile virus, and the mosquito comes out in the evening. And so we had to start looking around for when birds are asleep, where they at. And it's pretty amazing. So you have birds like on the right here. This is a drawing of Carolina wrens. So if you get in the Chicagoland area, Carolina wrens are starting to drop out because it's too far north. But the rest of Illinois, you have lots of Carolina wrens. And these Carolina wrens are use cavities. In fact, a bunch of them will stack up into cavities. Carolina wrens will also go into your garage or your shed or like huddle against your house. They just like kind of warm areas. And so that's why if you look at the distribution of Carolina wrens, you see a lot of them are using areas around people's houses. The other really important thing that birds like is dense shrubbery, dense trees. So in this picture, I'm not even sure what shrub that is, but it's a dense foliage, right? And so something where they feel safe, it gives them a little bit of a better microclimate. So birds use a lot of energy keeping themselves warm, no matter what time of year. And so just a little bit of cutting down the wind and a little bit of a microhabitat can be a benefit. And so these are one of the aspects we'll get to that's important when we're trying to provide habitat for wildlife in your backyard. A lot of birds are going to be breeding in your area. As opposed to lots of places in the world, we have lots of birds breeding in people's backyards. They're breeding in shrubs, trees, on top of your gutters, and old trees or telephone poles. You can even put out birdhouses for pearl martins or other birds like that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And so in some species, majority of their population in Illinois are found in towns. Most of these are raptors like peregrine falcons. Almost all the ones breeding in Illinois are all in Chicagoland area breeding on skyscrapers. Birds like red-bellied woodpecker, they do occur in forests, but a lot of them occur in towns. Mourning doves, robins kind of occur everywhere. Pearl martins, chimney swifts. Those are birds, chimney swifts, by their name, you should, it's clear that they breed in chimneys. Well, that's going to be associated with people, right? And so a lot of these urban areas are actually really important for birds. So habitat's what attracts and keeps the birds. So what are we talking about in terms of creating habitat for in your backyard? And first off, we're talking about structure. Here's just a picture of a natural area over on the Illinois River. And the thing to notice is it's not homogeneous. It's kind of a heterogeneous, right? You have some dense areas. You have some open areas. You have dense trees, open trees. We need heterogeneity, which is something you can produce in your backyard. So this is just a picture I found online, but it's a great example of dense areas, open areas. You got some trees, different layers. Layers are important, right? So in forests, when we go to do management in forests, we often think about the canopy, subcanopy, the bottom forest floor, and the understory. And the reality is that we can, the goal is to attain this structure and layers via native trees, shrubs, and grasses in your landscape, if you're interested in attracting birds and wildlife. Now, the tough one is forest floor. So that's really a tough thing to replicate if you don't have a really big property. If you just have kind of your backyard, the average backyard, it's really almost impossible to get the forest floor. But it's definitely possible to create layers where you essentially have a forest bird community in your backyard. So you're going to have cuckoos and orioles and flycatchers, pretty much everything that you can find in a big forest, you can have in your backyard if you have those different structures out there. So I wanted to provide, and so the reason I sent Tabitha the PDF of this talk was there's lots of plants out there. I know many of you probably know plants better than I that have a lot of value for wildlife. Now, in general, we want to plant native plants, but we'll talk a little bit about the issues with that here in a little bit. These are just some of the ones that we've worked with of late. So we're working on some programs with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources to create new native shrublands. As a lot of you probably know, if you go to a forest or a shrubland anywhere in Illinois, the vast majority of shrubs are going to be honeysuckle or autumn olive, multiple rose, buckthorn if you're up north. Those are all invasive species and really don't provide the resources that bird communities need. And so we've been planting these plants up in different state parks to try to look at how well they grow, how much attention we got to give them in terms of keeping the deer away, which is as you might guess, is a big feat. If we just plant them and don't water them, how many will make it, that kind of stuff. We're trying to kind of come up with the lowest common denominator to make shrubland habitats. But in your backyard, a lot of these can be really nice kind of accent plants, flowering plants that can really go well in your landscape. And I'll talk about a couple. One is something that people think of as weeds. And so it's always this big question about whether certain plants are weeds or are they food. In this case, pokeberry, which a lot of people consider a weed because it kind of is a weed. But if you look at birds like catbirds, black-throated green warbler, these are young eastern bluebirds. If you look at pokeberry and look at how quickly the fruit is devoured, in fall, it's a big food source for birds. I just completed teaching a course on campus on essentially monitoring and watching birds. And we went out and caught some birds with mist nets. And one thing that you figure out really quick in falls when you catch birds with mist nets, a lot of times they poop on you as soon as you catch them. And it's always purple because these catbirds and other things are all eating these pokeberries. And that's a very probably important aspect of their diet. Now, of course, a lot of people in their landscape don't like these. I mean, pokeberry is poisonous to humans. It'll make you sick, but not for birds. Then you have more problematic plants, such as bush honeysuckle. Now, true botanists would just cringe when I talk about honeysuckle being a potential value for birds. It is, but I think we do better, right? So there's been some efforts like here in Urbana, they've removed a bunch of honeysuckle from Anita Purvis Nature Center. They've done a bunch of buckthorn removal and honeysuckle removal up in Chicagoland areas and Kane County and DuPage County Forest Preserves, and which is fine as long as we can replace honeysuckle with some kind of native shrub. One thing you might notice with honeysuckle is that their berries usually are the last to be eaten because their berries really have low energetic value for birds. And so that's why when you do see birds in honeysuckle, it's usually in December when every other berry that's good for them, they've eaten, and they're really just kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to find whatever they can, and then they'll eat honeysuckle. For you that don't know much about honeysuckle, it's spread by birds, and it can be it grows very, very fast and get very, very dense very fast. So we'll talk a little bit about no-mow areas and some areas you can do in your backyard. And one of the struggles, and I have the struggle in my backyard, is keeping the honeysuckle out. It's a constant fight. And then if you can't get native shrubs to go for one reason or other, then honeysuckle is better than nothing, at least in the context of birds. Another great plant, shrub, that for birds, it has great fall color, it's got great flowers, and the berries are actually pretty tasty to humans, is Serviceberry, Amulanker. Here's cedar waxwing, blue grosbeak, and some Amulankers. So I have several in my yard, and you can tell that it's a very high quality forage because they disappear so fast, right? So as soon as they become ripe, my tree is just overwhelmed with all kinds of bird species, and even squirrels are up there too eating these serviceberries. It's one of the kind of foundation plants I try to put out there in areas to try to provide some good cover. I mean, you can kind of grow them as a dense shrub or a kind of a medium-sized tree, and it's really a benefit to the birds. All right, so let's talk about trees a little bit. Now, obviously, there's lots of trees out there, but in the context of what's good for wildlife, particularly birds, it really comes down to oaks and hardwoods. And that's not just because they produce acorns. So the acorns are good. Squirrels are going to like them. Blue jays will like them. If there's a smaller type of oak acorn, then you have other, like titmice will eat them, chickadees, that kind of stuff. But it's really the Lepidoptera, caterpillars. So in this side picture, you can see some caterpillars feeding on an oak leaf. That is what oaks do to help birds by far. So there's been lots of research done both here in Illinois and throughout Eastern North America showing that these trees I listed here support the most amount of insects, which thus support the most amount of birds. So it's not even close for a lot of species. So when there was a interesting study done down the Champaign National Forest on a bunch of migratory warblers coming through, and they found that oaks and hickories, and to some degree, and it's kind of a weird, if you guys know your trees, it's kind of a weird assortment of trees. I still don't know why locust and tulip trees support so much insects. Chestnut is not very common anymore because of chestnut blight, but where it was common, apparently it supported a lot of insects. Hackberry and cherry. But oaks and hickories are what we promote a lot. I know they grow kind of slow, but there's great value in terms of the habitat they provide. And it really comes down to insects. So in this picture here, there's a lot going on, but you might have noticed, well, if you have lived in Illinois for quite a while, you might have noticed a decline in certain birds that eat insects, or you might have noticed as you drive around the countryside, 20 years ago, if you drove around at night, your window would get covered in smushed bugs, right? But now, especially in certain areas of Illinois, you don't even hit a bug at night. And so these insects are really declining. We have and this, for most of you, this won't apply to your backyard, but we have a study we've been doing for a few years and will continue for a few years on a bird called whippoorwill. So whippoorwill is a forest bird that gets its name because it says, whippoorwill. I couldn't mimic it, but I won't do a good job. But, a lot of us probably when we were, 10, 15, 20 years ago, remember going out to certain areas and hearing whippoorwills sing at night. Well, they're pretty much gone from lots of Illinois. And so we've been putting out traps to look at where insects are. So this picture on the left here is just some of the moths we caught in one trap. That Ziploc bag on the bottom right, that's one trap one night from our trap that we did up at Kankakee Sands up by Kankakee, Illinois. And that's actually one of the areas that still has whippoorwills. And so what this comes down to, well, there's a lot of things going on here. One is probably it's been our use of pesticides, primarily in agriculture, that probably have knocked down a lot of the insect populations. But also the plants we have out there don't often support lots of insects. And so trying to have a diverse landscape with hardwoods and flowering plants, succulents will support pollinators and moths that will greatly benefit a lot of these birds. So there's lots of research now on the decline of like chimney swifts. So chimney swifts and whippoorwills essentially just fly around with their mouths open, right, at night, catching whatever they can. We have technology now on campus where when we catch whippoorwills, as I mentioned before, when you catch a bird, one of the first things they do is typically poop on you. So we can take the fecal sample and sequence it and use DNA technologies to determine what they ate. And so we can determine what are the most important insects. And we know from our whippoorwill research and some other research we've done is that these moths are really important. If there's not those moths around, they will eat like June bugs and some other beetles, but mostly they want to eat these moths. And so we really trying to figure out first off, why the moths are declining, and then second, what we can do to get these moths back. Here's some more, just some trees and some different, more specific details about these trees. Again, most of these are hardwoods, hickories and oaks to a poplar, linden or basswood. So a lot of these are, solid trees that help wildlife. The trees that aren't so beneficial for wildlife are typically ash, maples, elms. These are, not to say they're of no value at all. They just, if you compare the amount of insects, the amount of birds that use ash trees and maple trees to oak trees and hickory trees, it's not even close. And then elms actually probably have more value, as a lot of them are dead from Dutch elm disease, and a lot of birds are using them for places for cavities and for food. But when they're alive, elms also don't have, for some reason, just don't support as much insect biomass, and thus don't support as many birds as you would hope. And also, as you guys all know, the ash are dying because of the emerald ash borer. So generally speaking, they're not a good plant to plant in your yard anyway, because I'm sure they're cheap at Menards or Walmart right now, but chances are they're not going to live very long. So there's some questions about, and I always get these questions about, we push growing native trees. Years ago, before Mayor Daley stepped down as the mayor of Chicago, he had a bird committee. So it was a bunch of us that were responsible for trying to figure out how to make Lakeshore Drive and areas around Soldier Field more friendly for birds. And one of the first things we said was, well, native plants should be better. Well, all right, there's native versus exotic versus introduced versus cultivars. I just got done lecturing in my other class about, not all invasive species are the same, right? So you have invasive species like honeysuckle or buckthorn that just take over forests. And then you have, things that maybe aren't native, like pine trees, right? So pine trees are native to certain parts of Illinois, but for most of Illinois, they probably weren't native. But they don't get out of control, and they definitely provide habitat for lots of wildlife. Yews, arborvitae, mountain ash, all these probably weren't native to much of Illinois, but they definitely provide great habitat for wildlife and birds. And thus, it's really kind of making the list of really nasty invasives. That are, we just want to keep out. And then you have others that are, maybe the word's benign. So they're, if you have a choice, it's better off to go with natives, but sometimes it's okay to go with arborvitae or some of the pine species, because they're really not going to become an invasive problem. All right, so now we're to the point where, okay, so we know what habitat we want to plant. So I see a lot of people are asking questions on chat, which is great. So when we get done, I'll just kind of go back through and answer as many as I can if I can't answer them all. So we know what habitat we want, right? We know what birds are coming through Illinois. We got breeding birds, wintering birds, migratory birds. We know that it's habitat they need, structure, layers, they need insects, they need food. So how do we provide these? Now, to some degree, we can kind of cheat with food and not provide the trees they might need, or the shrubs they need for food, and bird feeders. We'll talk about hummingbirds, we'll talk about mowing, dead leaves, and we'll talk about some nesting areas. So bird feeders. So I get questions about bird feeders a lot. So there's some concern that bird feeders kind of make birds soft, right? So you're keeping birds around that should be migrating, or it's not helping the population as a whole. If you look at the kind of across all the research done on this, my take is it probably helps certain individuals, but it's really, the benefit of bird feeding is probably more for the appreciation of birds than it is really helping at a population level. And there's some evidence like red-bellied woodpeckers and northern cardinals, and so they're expanding their ranges north. And so if they're like in northern Wisconsin, it's -30, a bird feeder will help them survive one evening when they might have died. Uh, mourning doves, which over here, mourning doves are notorious for being one of the dumbest birds out there. I could lecture all day about the intelligence of birds. So the number one intelligent bird is American crow, whereas one of the dumbest is mourning doves. So mourning doves will literally sit underneath bird feeders and eat until their toes freeze off. So you catch mourning doves sometimes missing toes because they just sit there and eat. And feeders are probably important for mourning doves. Of course, mourning doves are amazingly abundant and amazingly reproductive. So, and then even like turkey vultures, right? So you don't think about this, but essentially roads are providing more dead stuff for them. And so there's almost like bird feeders for them to take advantage of. But again, I don't see bird feeders as actually being that positive or negative, except for hummingbirds, which we'll talk about in a second. I see them as being a great way for people to, if they want to have a yard that has a lot of habitat for birds and breeding birds, migratory birds, then if you want to feed birds, it's a great way of seeing them, right? So a lot of these birds are hard to identify. They're going to be at the very top of the trees, like rose-breasted grosbeak. Those birds, if you don't know their song, you probably never know they're in your backyard. But you put a sunflower seed feeder out, and within half an hour, sometimes they're going to be down there right in front of you eating. So, and if we're going to really achieve conservation, we have to have appreciation. And so kids can see the birds better and really for education reasons. So, so that I think it's not bad and it could be beneficial. The hummingbird is another case. Here is eBird data showing this is the movement of hummingbirds down from the Yucatan up through the Midwest in the summer, and they're going to come back down, and you can see them as they go back down to Mexico. Now, hummingbirds, we've done a bunch of research on these to see if they actually cross the Gulf of Mexico, fly across it, because they can if they, theoretically, from their energy and how fast their wings beat, on that kind of stuff, they should be able to make it across. But it turns out they don't. And so this is one of the interesting studies we did a few years ago. So we were tracking a bunch of hummingbirds with transmitters. Now you might think, how do you do that? Hummingbirds are really small, but we had like 0.1 gram transmitters, super, super small little things we put on their back to track them. And it turns out we had this way of tracking them in the Yucatan. None of them were showing up. I couldn't figure out what's going on. So it turns out they're just bouncing from trailer park of snowbirds that go down to Louisiana or Texas for the winter and feed it their hummingbird feeder for 30 minutes, fly the next one. And there's actually trailer parks, of campers all the way around Texas and all the way down through Mexico even. And they're just kind of making their way around. So it's pretty clear to me that hummingbirds have almost evolved to take advantage of hummingbird feeders. I mean, I have one in my backyard, and it's amazing. You put it up and they're there the next day. And so because they know the search image, they know what they are, right? And they can they take advantage of those to help with their survival. Now, this time of year around here, there's still some hummingbirds around, and people argue that the hummingbird feeders are keeping them north, and so they should be migrating. I don't know. I mean, natural selection is going to kick in at some point, right? If a hummingbird's still around now, even if I have a hummingbird feeder, it's probably not going to make it. But I don't think it makes a population level difference. All right, a little bit about mowing. So mowing is an interesting thing. I don't know if you guys have thought too much about this, and it's really cultural, right? So one of the I live outside of Urbana in a town called St. Joseph, and some of our neighbors have big areas they mow. And I see them, and they said, "Man, I just spent 2 hours mowing my back, few acres. I really hate it." I'm like, well, the solution is don't mow it, right? So this is not a difficult thing, right? So we mow way more areas than we need to, right? And it goes back to a cultural phenomenon in Europe and North America. There's a great story about in Ford County, when the first Europeans got here, one person owned most of Ford County, and they'd rented out areas to tenant farmers. And one of the stipulations was, if I rent this out to you, if I drive by your house, it better be well manicured. Everything should be mowed. And so, that was 200 years ago. And still today, in different areas of Illinois, people have a more or less tendency to mow like roadsides and every stitch of grass. And if you ask them, they can't tell you why they're doing it. And there's some books about this, thinking that goes back to European manners, right? Where the Duke of so-and-so had this manor where it was impeccably manicured. And so people, as they came to the new world, just thought that was the way to go. So we mow crazy amounts. Now, ideally, we could have no mow or low mow areas. So we have some of these on campus. And here's a couple pictures of certain areas. These are areas that will have more insects. If people that are here on campus or visit campus, you'll notice some of our no-mow areas in the south part of campus, that's where we have kestrels at. So kestrels are a small falcon that eats mice and insects. And just by not mowing those areas, you get a lot of those birds there. When they started doing no-mow years ago, but I was on campus and they were getting letters to the editor saying, this just shows it's a blight on U of I's campus. It makes us look lazy. And so I thought it was interesting that it's just a cultural thing, right? So I have a no-mow area in my backyard, and I shouldn't be mean to my mother-in-law, but because she's nice, but she's from Iowa, grew up on a farm area. And so she was at our house once and saw a garter snake in the no-mow area. And she's like, well, I guess you got to get it out there. I'm like, that's the whole purpose, right? So I have a no-mow area for the snake, and it just won't compute with her, right? She just can't understand, why would you do such a thing? I mean, and in her mind, that's an ugly blight in the backyard, and that it's an area that we need to mow. Now, no-mows aren't always a solution, right? It's like my no-mow area, I eventually had to mow it because I was getting so much honeysuckle coming up in it. And then, there is times like along roadsides, you have to mow occasionally to keep the woody vegetation out. And so we work with a lot of people that just don't do early season mowing, right? So wait till July to mow. So let it grow up. And then if you got to mow late. And that way it's provided the resources for breeding and migratory birds. And then you can mow it in, July, and then again, in August. And that will, I mean, it's still not great, but it definitely, the early season mowing is really hurts birds. I see there's some questions, so we'll get to those when I get done here. All right, leaves. So this is, there's an interesting study that just came out a few months ago about leaves in backyards and how much they provide for birds. This is a picture of an ovenbird. And so they found that a lot of these leaves have insect eggs on them or support insects, and that by leaving the leaves and not picking them all up, you actually provide a lot of structure on the ground for insects that then are taken advantage of by birds. And so what they recommend is, if you have to mow some up, mulch them. But they really recommend is, we know that leaves in the ground are going to kill your grass and kill maybe other vegetation. But if there's certain areas where you can't, like in my yard, I got certain areas by some pines, and then and some dense areas in the back with shrubs where I can't grow anything anyway underneath there. That's not really a weed. And so I just let the leaves congregate in that area. And just today I was looking back there, and there was a bunch of juncos. So dark-eyed juncos are back in town. They came south, they come down here in winter from up north, and they are scratching around, foraging in the leaves. And it really dawned on me, I didn't really thought about this, but you don't see them scratching around in the grass. And so it would suggest that there's a lot more insects in the leaves that they're taking advantage of. I saw a quick comment here from Susan about roadsides for wildlife. And so that's a great example. So I grew up over by Jacksonville, Illinois, and my dad still lives over there. And so when I was growing up, we had quail, Bob White, and so the last 15, 20 years are gone, and we don't mow our roadsides, but our neighbor does. And so for years, he'll say, I saw you didn't get around to mowing your roadside. Don't worry about it, took care of it for you. And we explained to him, and he realizes that quail are gone because they can't move between grasslands anymore because red-tailed hawks eat them. He just can't stop himself from mowing. I mean, he's 80 something now, but he just has to mow everything, right? And so trying to get roadsides for wildlife, the guy that runs that for Department of Natural Resources is a friend of mine, and it's an uphill battle, right? People just want to mow. And so it's one of those things where it's cultural, right? So hopefully through education and demonstrations, like I saw someone put something about a demonstration on the chat, that we can show that, having an area not mowed doesn't mean you're lazy. It means that, it'd be a good area to, it's a good area for wildlife. All right, a little bit about breeding areas. So lots of areas in your backyard birds are using to breed. A lot of times I think people don't realize how much is being used in their backyard. If you had a red-headed woodpecker like these birds on the left, that would be pretty, you probably wouldn't miss them because they're pretty loud and they're pretty colorful. But, wrens. So there's house wrens all over in towns, Carolina wrens, chickadees, blue jays. Amazingly, blue jays are pretty raucous birds and pretty colorful, but you'd be amazingly surprised on how sneaky they can be when they're nesting in your yard. So we did a study on blue jays, and their nests are tough to find because they don't make a peep and they sneak into their nests. That way predators can't find their nests. And so you probably have a lot more birds breeding around your yard than you're aware of. One thing I like to have is dead trees. Eventually you got to take so I've had several dead trees in my yard, and it's funny, sometimes my neighbors even come over and say, I saw you got a dead tree, I'll take care of it for you, don't worry about it. Like something about, I just don't have the inclination or a chainsaw to cut it down. And I'm always trying to explain to them, no, I like it for the birds. And they look at me like I'm crazy. But, when a tree dies, you typically have a year before it actually is going to be a problem falling down. And so during that time, it provides a lot of habitat for insects, cavities for, the cavities are made by woodpeckers, but then they're used by lots of other species. And so they can really be a benefit. A lot of times, it can be dangerous. You don't want to fall on your house and your cars and that kind of stuff. But when appropriate, they can definitely be a benefit for breeding habitat. All right, what about threats? Let's talk about cats and windows and some lights. Outdoor cats. So cats are very controversial. There's pretty good data now, and I know these are crazy big numbers, but they might eat up to 1 billion birds a year. So cats are kind of programmed to kill, right? And so there's a big push to try to keep cats indoors as much as we can. People put bells on them, but there was some great research in New York showing that the cats can figure out how to kill birds without their bell ringing. And just overall, it's just best to keep them indoors. If you have cats, you probably notice that, they'll kill something and bring it back to you. And so there's been studies where people have collected what things they brought back over the course of a year. And there's lots of birds that brought back. Several years ago, I did a study here on campus where we caught feral cats. So these cats were out in the South Farms or out in the country. And most of them they're all on the South Farms because they're not supposed to be on the South Farms. And we put a transmitter on their collar. We put a collar on them, put a transmitter, and the transmitter would record the death screams, whatever they ate, right? So when they kill something, they're making a bunch of noise, and that would send the data back to me. And it was interesting. So that happened for a while. And then eventually all the cats we were tracking, we'd hear them eating dried cat food. And then occasionally we hear people talking. Well, campus found out that we were recording people's conversations via these like secret cats. And so one of the provost told us we couldn't do that anymore. But the moral of the story was, while these cats are out there, people are taking care of them, but they're still letting them roam around killing, in the little bit of data we got, they were killing a lot of stuff. Lots of mice were getting killed, but also lots of birds. The good and bad about nature backdoors, right? So a lot of us like to have nature. And, if you look at the cost of houses on nature preserves versus not nature preserves, and where people are wanting to buy houses these days, a lot of people are wanting nature. Of course, it's not all good, right? And so you just got to keep that in mind. Deer, raccoons, birds making nests in your siding, all those things. There's positive and negatives of bringing wildlife into your backyard. Though I guess in my opinion, it's mostly positive. But of course, if you bring them in your backyard, from my opinion, there's kind of a responsibility to try to make sure we reduce the threats. Another threat are window kills. And so birds run into windows, or in some cases, see lights and fly into them. So this big picture here is all the birds I found dead flying into a couple buildings. I think this was in Toronto, but they do the same thing in Chicago. This bird on the left is a Tennessee warbler. And one of my students in the class just sent me this picture a couple days ago. It flew into the window at Cersei, the campus recreation area there on campus. So why do birds fly into windows is one question. Well, they see the reflection of trees or open sky. I should say, or not open sky, and they think they can get through there, so they fly into it. They see their reflection. So this is mostly in like a rear view mirror. So sometimes you see a cardinal, and they just just attacking the rearview mirror, and that's more of a territorial thing, right? It thinks it's a rival male, and usually if you just cover up the rearview mirror for a couple of days, that will reduce that. A big issue in Chicago, especially in really urban areas, is plants inside the lobby. So there's no plants outside, but inside these fancy high rises, there's all these tropical plants, and birds are flying in there. One of the issues I had at my house was they were seeing through multiple windows. So I have kind of a walkway going to the garage, and there was windows on both sides, and the birds would see through then, and so they'd see open sky, so they would smack into it. And so I was able to kind of stop this by moving a chair, a little ottoman that's in the way now, and so birds don't see through there, so they don't fly in there anymore. There's also collisions at night. So bright lights on large buildings will attract birds. So at the McCormick Place up in Chicago, used to have to use a wheelbarrow every morning to pick up all the dead birds. But turning off lights at night are important. For most of you, it's probably not a big deal. It's mostly a big issue if you're living in a high rise in Chicago or other big cities. Lighthouses, communication towers can also kill birds, but that's kind of, you guys probably don't have to worry about lighthouses and communication towers in your backyard. And so to stop the collisions, you can change the lighting behind the windows, like I talked about, like me moving the ottoman. Birds do see in the UV, and so birds are seeing the world fundamentally different than we are. So I can answer more questions about that later. But there are UV decals, so we don't see them because we don't see in the ultraviolet spectrum, but birds see them. I don't know that they work very well. I've seen them. I don't think they work very well. I think the best thing to do is put up strings or stripes. So on campus, we're working with facilities there's a few windows on campus that kill the majority of birds. And all you got to do is put up some, either some strings or some fabric stripes, or this person in this picture is putting up a tape. That seems to work really good to keep the birds from flying into it. And in some cases, it's mostly migratory birds. So you only have to do that for a couple of weeks in spring and a couple of weeks in the fall. Again, the Lights Out program is a program in Chicago, Toronto, Detroit, New York, where they turn lights out at a certain time at night. And so the birds don't fly into these buildings. Hawks and owls, I put this on as a threat, but really it's not. So hawks and owls are part of a healthy ecosystem. So if you guys ever go over to Europe or parts of Asia, I'm always struck by there's no raptors, right? So you go to London and you can barely find a bird. You go to Beijing, and yeah, you can barely find a bird. In North America, we're lucky that we still have in urban areas a diverse suite of birds. And so that includes Cooper's hawks that may be sitting on your bird feeder killing birds. I get lots of calls about, Cooper's hawks eating my, mourning doves, or a great horned owl eating all my rabbits. But, there's pluses and minuses, right? So if you want to have wildlife in your backyard, the more wildlife you get, the more likely you're to attract predators like Cooper's hawks or great horned owls. All right, so kind of wrapping this up, what the future might hold. So cultural change, I think, is what we need, right? So going along with this no-mow area, right? So understanding that messy is okay. A lot of times, and I've really seen a big change in this over the years, where people want to have highly manicured, perfectly pristine yards, and people are going to more messy yards, right? Where, it's still something you can use and enjoy. It's just not as manicured. Urban areas are definitely important for wildlife. If you look at where conservation is happening throughout the Midwest and in Illinois, a lot of it's in urban areas with forest preserve districts, the city of Chicago. If you look at, we have endangered species like black-crowned night herons, snow egrets that are only breeding in urban areas. And so urban areas, we can't ignore those. They're important for conservation. And so you guys can all do your part. And then finally, conservation is tied to appreciation, right? And it starts in your backyard. So whether you're, 8 or 80, appreciating conservation is something you can do sitting in your back patio on your yard, on a chair, looking at, robins moving around. And so in order to do conservation and to appreciate nature, we have to have the ability to do it. And so by gardening and having wildlife there is one way to achieve this. Also, birds are changing their behavior. So in this figure here, this is a chipping sparrow and field sparrow. So back in the 60s, there were more field sparrows around in Illinois than chipping sparrows. And then somewhere in the 70s and 80s, chipping sparrows realized, what the hell am I doing? I should be hanging out in people's backyard, breeding in their blue spruce and eating on the grass. And that's what they did. Field sparrows never changed. So they need really dense shrubland grasslands that are pretty big. And so we see lots of examples where birds just changed. I mentioned mourning doves before. We have data from Illinois in 1900s, 1950s, and 2000s. And so 1900s, they didn't occur in developed areas. These are towns. And then just look at these hashed bars. So between 1906, 07 and 1956, 57, these mourning doves realized, what am I doing trying to make it out in the wilderness? I'm going to move into towns, hang out under people's bird feeders or hanging out in their backyards, and it's going to make my life a lot easier. And so lots of species are doing this. This is one of the most common things we see where birds are essentially changing, right? They learn just like every other animal learns, and they're learning that people are going to feed me in town. People have great backyards, and we're seeing more and more birds moving into towns. And it's likely that's going to continue in the future, right? There's no reason to think it will stop. Pollinators, trying to get insects out there, but also monarchs. So we just had a seminar in NRES, the department I'm in a couple of days ago, about the decline of monarchs. And by creating backyards that have both flowering different types of growing season, are going to benefit pollinators, going to benefit insects, going to benefit birds, going to be kind of all the way around a good thing to do. And I found this online, this rethink pretty kind of thing. And I think that's important, right? So it's just rethinking how we do landscaping. It's a little more work in certain ways of doing this, but I think the benefits will pay off in the long run. Oops. So the future of backyards, greater diversity of birds, importance for conservation education. And again, one thing I'm always promoting is every little bit counts. So in Illinois, we have about 1.5 million acres of protected areas. That would be like nature preserves or refuges, that kind of stuff. Well, there's 21-ish million acres of corn and soybeans. We're not going to be able to do conservation if we don't have people in their backyards kind of making them nice, kind of like this, right? So in this picture here, it's dense, lots of ornamentals, lots of maybe non-native flowers, but I'm sure this supports lots of birds. This figure here is from a recent paper talking about since 1970, we've lost 2.5 billion migratory birds. We can all do our part, right? So a backyard, anybody's backyard in a given year can support hundreds of migratory birds. And it's all this little bit you can do to support those. So I know I went through a lot of information, went through it fast. So please feel free to contact me at any time if you have questions about birds or plants. I'm probably better on the birds and the plants, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Here's a few more resources out there. These come from Great Lakes Audubon, National Audubon, and eBird, which is the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. All these are great resources out there about both learning birds, what to plant in your backyard, enjoying birds from your home, those kind of things. And I'll finish on this picture. This is the evening grosbeak. This is a bird that's super rare in Illinois, but apparently I just heard today that a few showed up in northern Illinois. And so this is a bird that when they do show up, they show up in your backyard. So again, thanks. And I'll start going through questions if I have time.
Yeah, Dr. Ward, thank you so much. A lot of great information and help us to build our backyard gardens to attract birds. I'm going to launch the poll. And in the meantime, Dr. Ward.
Yep, I can start going through. Go ahead.
Yeah. Do squirrels keep birds away was one of the questions that was asked.
No, squirrels and birds compete, but and squirrels can be the bane of their existence if you're doing with bird feeders. But squirrels, we have seen squirrels eat birds out of bird nests, but it's just part of nature, right? So they're competing, but it's fine. Having both is going to be fine.
Thank you. Catherine B asks or says she's read that it's important to have feeders either closer to the house than 3 feet so that birds can build enough momentum to harm themselves if they fly toward the window, or 10 feet or more away so that they have time to maneuver to avoid windows. Anything to say about that?
Yeah, so usually birds figure out where windows are. The birds that hit your windows are mostly migrants. So I actually like putting the feeder farther away from the house. I mean, they can build a momentum pretty fast. And the farther you put it away, the more likely that if there's noises coming from your house or you're walking by a window, you're not going to freak them out. And so I'm kind of an advocate of putting the feeder far enough away where you can still enjoy the birds, but they're far enough from you, so you're not, if you're walking by your window doing dish or something, you're not going to freak them out.
Very good. Somebody commented that they had just bought Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. It's a great book on the no-mow grass topic. Do you have anything to say, Dr. Ward, about brome bird feeders?
No, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say almost all bird feeders are, I don't know. I make my own, but I think any bird feeder you get is pretty good. I mean, with hummingbird feeders, you got to be careful. You want to make sure you don't, you make the nectar the right concoction, the right percentage of sugar, because it can make hummingbirds sick. But for all other feeders, I mean, like the feeder I put in my backyard yesterday is just a board with some, some edges on so they don't knock all the seed off. I mean, you don't have to be fancy.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Allison mentioned she has so many house sparrows that are feeders, almost in an infestation, pushing out other bird species. What to do?
Yeah, house sparrows are a problem. Interestingly, house sparrows are actually declining. And in some of their native areas in Europe, they're actually endangered species. And so in Illinois, they're declining pretty fast. But in certain areas, they get out of control. The couple things you can do is use different types of seed. So they have a harder time with sunflower. So you could put sunflower out there, and that would promote cardinals and blue jays. You could put a thistle feeder out there that supports house finches and goldfinches. And the openings on thistle feeders are so small that house sparrows can't get their bill in there. So there's a few different types of feeders. If you do have a big house sparrow problem that you can go to, you're still probably going to have house sparrows around, but it's definitely going to allow other birds to forage.
Okay, great. We had quite a few people looking for where to find pawpaw trees. Any advice on that?
So where to find them?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know per se. I can tell you that we order most of our trees and shrubs from Forest Keeling Nursery, and it's in Missouri, and they have a lot of natives. But yeah, I know there's, well, as I said, my dad was a nurseryman, so he would say go to your local nursery. They have a lot of expertise, and he would say don't go to Walmart or Menards, but I've gone to those places as well. And so the problem with going with Walmart or Menards or places is they don't have a lot of expertise, but sometimes you can find really good native oaks and hickories there. I don't know. They just seem to get random stuff in there. So I just keep looking around when I'm around to see what I can find. Pawpaw, I know Forest Keeling has pawpaw, and some of those native ones are harder to get going sometimes and don't make them as much money. And so you got to look at some of these bigger nurseries.
Okay. Yeah, and there were a couple of comments that came through. Someone had found some at Stark Brothers online.
Yeah.
And Possibility Place as well. It's another location. Let's see. Kim asked, when you noted locust as a hardwood tree to support insects, were you referring to Robinia or Gladistitia?
Yeah, I don't know. So I was referring to honey locust. So I don't know the scientific name for it, but I know there's black locust, and some of the locusts get out of control. It's the one that's more ornamental that for some reason supports a lot more insects. I just don't, it's weird. I don't know why, but if you'll notice that in the spring, if you find a good honey locust in a town, it is loaded with migratory birds.
Okay. On the slide about the emerald ash, or the ash tree, sorry, Susan asked that she thought the emerald ash borer in the ash tree has drawn woodpeckers that she's never seen before. Is that true?
It is true. So woodpecker populations for all of them are going up almost. Red-headed woodpecker populations are going down a bit, but pileated, which is the really big one, is getting much more common. Redbud woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers, hairy woodpeckers, those are all getting much more common. And I think it is because the dead ash, the dead elms are providing good places for them to breed and lots of insects. And so again, dead trees aren't always bad. Lots of dead trees are probably bad, but a few dead trees in the forest or in your backyard are often a good thing.
Okay. Back to pawpaws. How does the pawpaw attract the swallowtail?
So I think on their my understanding is they have a flower. Like all trees have a small flower, and so certain times a year they attract pollinators. So some of these trees have a very short period of time when they're really good for wildlife. For example, like walnuts. So they leaf out pretty late, and then they have with their kind of flowers kind of late, and so they don't last very long. But when it does happen, they're loaded, and so that's another reason why in someone's backyard it's good to have a good variety of different trees, because they typically are not, they have different phenologies and such that they're supporting insects at different, a couple weeks apart.
Okay. Bridget asks back on Serviceberry shrubs, stated that the birds go crazy for them, but at a certain point, the berries become infected with a fungus, which to her understanding comes from the junipers, many of that her neighbors have. Can she do anything to prevent or treat the serviceberry for the fungus?
I don't know. So I hadn't heard that. We do see where berries birds get drunk off berries. They get sort of fermenting if they don't get used, but I don't know what causes that. But I'm not aware of that. But yeah, if she emails me, I can look into it and see. Yeah, okay. I mean, it makes a little sense, but I'm not sure what you can do about it.
Yeah. Okay. Emily asks, how do city ordinances support or hinder low-mow or no-mow areas?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Particularly, yeah.
So, I mean, most there's ordinances in most places, and they vary on how tall the grass can be. And a lot of places, if you actually have some ornamentals out there or have some management of it, you can argue that, it's not, when they say no mow, they just want a weedy area that's abandoned house. If you actually are manicuring certain parts of your yard or have some attention to it, my understanding is most cities won't bug you. But I have got emails before saying, this village is really mad at me for my no mow area. What can I do? And I don't know exactly. But I do know that in a lot of areas these days, no mow is getting much more common. And if it's done in the context of habitat and it's not like you're not managing it, you're just not mowing it for a period of time, that you can usually talk to the city and they'll be okay with it.
Okay, very good. Catherine B asks, do birds eat black chokeberry? She's come across conflicting information. No, they're too astringent. Yes, certain birds especially like them in the winter, etc.
Yeah, I've seen them eating chokeberry, so I'm sure they do. There's a list I didn't put on here of kind of which berries are like the best. It's like serviceberries go fast, and pokeberries and honeysuckles last. And so kind of chokecherry and cherries and like native grapes and those kind of things, they get eaten, not first, but they're eaten. And most birds can eat almost anything, right? These migratory birds are going from the Arctic to Amazon, and so they're eating all kinds of different things the whole way through. And so it's pretty rare to find. There is at least one introduced Asian plant, I forget its name, that causes some problems for like waxwings and robins. But for the most part, birds are amazingly tough in being able to eat almost any type of berry and being able to deal with it.
Okay. Ellen asks, should you clean out the bird houses and take them down for the winter?
You should definitely clean them out, but don't take them down. So bird houses, birds if they nest in there, they're going to have parasites, blowflies and lice and those kind of things. Nothing that's going to affect you, but stuff that can affect the birds. So we typically, at this time of year, I would clean them out. But birds, like I said, Carolina wrens, bluebirds do this a lot. So bluebirds like to go into a box in winter. So bluebirds are getting much more common. So they spend the winter in Illinois. And so it's kind of like, someplace to get out of the wind. And so I would definitely leave the boxes up over the winter. I would just clean them out.
Okay, very good. Well, I think that was our last question from the chat box, Dr. Ward. Okay. A lot of nice comments, a great presentation, appreciated everything, learned a lot. And so thank you again to Dr. Ward for joining us this evening. And thank you to everyone for being here with us this evening.
Yeah, thanks again. And feel free to email me if you have any more questions.
Great, thank you.
All right.